Hello and welcome. This is Devika Chopra, and you're watching NewsX. Now, 2 days after making very serious allegations against India for extortion, coercion, gun violence, murder, and extrajudicial killings on Canadian soil, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau testified before the Foreign Interference Inquiry Committee that was set up by his government to look into very serious charges of foreign influence in Canada's democratic system. Justin Trudeau claims that his position against India is not by choice, but forced by circumstance. Yet he's unable to share any crucial details or evidence with India on why his intel agencies and the police force believe India is behind an increase in violence against the South Asian community of Canada. Joining me on NewsX is Alex Zoltan, a Canadian investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker, to give us a very real Canadian perspective. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. I've been tracking some of the work that you put out in the recent days on X. If you could just tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, what exactly is the work that you do in Canada?
Sure. So, as you noted, I'm an independent investigative journalist. I'm a bit of a muckraker. I like to dunk on Trudeau when I can, and which he makes it pretty easy. And yeah, I also like to cover kind of niche subjects in Canada, and the Khalistani separatist movement would be one of those that I've taken a particular interest in. I grew up in Surrey, which has the largest Sikh diaspora probably outside of India, anywhere in the world. So I've been exposed to it my entire life, and I'm kind of morbidly curious and fascinated by it.
Okay. Alex, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that right after the RCMP and then Justin Trudeau came out with their statements about India once again, almost a year after they made allegations last year, you attended an online event by Sikhs for Justice. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that? What was that about?
Sure. So yeah, it was a response from Sikhs for Justice. They had a lawyer from New York on a Zoom call, as well as 6 or 7 representatives of the Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara in the Newton neighborhood of Surrey, BC. And they made several requests of the Canadian government, including a request to close down the embassies in Vancouver and Toronto. They also mentioned an embassy in Montreal, but I'm not sure if there is an embassy in Montreal. But in any case, that's what they requested from the Canadian government.
And did you end up asking any questions as a part
Yeah,
of
I
this
asked
event?
I asked them through which channels they submitted the request, and the lawyer
Mm-hmm.
from the Sikhs for Justice said that they would be submitting a request through a lawyer. And then I asked what their timeline was in terms of an anticipated response, and they kind of thought that maybe I wasn't taking them seriously, because I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that they're really expecting a response either. I think it was more or less a publicity stunt of sorts.
That's interesting that you say that because just a couple of days back, I believe CBC called Gurpatwant Singh Pannu. They gave him a platform. He's the leader of Sikhs for Justice and he's a designated terrorist in India. I'm going to quickly play out that soundbite for us to listen to as well on what he said. And then I just like to understand your views on this, Alex.
Sure.
Like what Prime Minister Trudeau, when they made this statement yesterday publicly, it shows their Canada's unwavering commitment to justice, a rule of law, and the national security. And Sikhs for Justice have been communicating with the Prime Minister office for the last 2 to 3 years, detailing all the spy network.
So there you have it. Something similar to what you mentioned as well, right? That the lawyer mentioned that they've been writing to the Prime Minister's office, but they weren't really clear as to whether they get any response per se from the office. But we have Pannu, who's probably using this entire um, controversy, one can say right now, to come in and insert his own narrative that I have been for the past 2 to 3 years communicating with the Prime Minister's office itself and sending them information about this alleged spy network that India is running in Canada. How do the people of Canada somewhere feel about that?
Oh, well, I would say that the vast majority of Canadians don't care. To be perfectly honest with you, I would say that most Canadians are apathetic about most things. And this subject would definitely fit within that large basket of things Canadians don't care about. Within Surrey, people kind of care. Obviously, the people in the Sikh diaspora care a lot. But on the whole, on the aggregate, Canadians really don't even understand what's happening, let alone that there's something happening. I don't even know if they know that there's something happening at all. They're pretty oblivious to it.
Okay, that's interesting. So if they are oblivious to it, why do you think Justin Trudeau wants to make this a really big issue? What's happening domestically in Canada that's pushing Justin Trudeau to the point where he is bringing this up over and over again?
Well, on the issue of Pennon, you mentioned that he's on the terrorist watch list in India. I
Yes.
imagine that is, yeah. So he also was the main character of a CBC documentary that came out just about 6 months ago. It's very unpopular in India. It actually, in my opinion, is a very biased documentary. It does a very good job of explaining the logic behind Justin Trudeau's accusations without providing any evidence. It does not whatsoever take any of India's positions. It's not a fair documentary. But I think that Justin Trudeau's accusations may have weight to them. Just because he doesn't have evidence doesn't mean that something did not occur. I think that it's a political misfire to make a comment on something if you don't have evidence to support it. So I question his judgment. And I guess in that case, to answer your question, Justin Trudeau is not a person of good judgment. He does things on compulsion. He does things erratically. He is a fairly decent political strategist, but he's obviously not a great political strategist. He's almost polling in the single digits now. So I don't think that there was any sort of chess move going on here. I think that Justin Trudeau is very, very much has the brain of a child, and he's playing checkers. And it would be like playing chess with a pigeon to try to think what Justin Trudeau is thinking.
But Alex, at the same time, Justin Trudeau has not come out and he's spun this whole narrative where he says that there are officials of the Indian government, particularly diplomats, that are collecting information against Canadians who don't like Narendra Modi. He's not really gone into the specifics of, say, okay, these are Khalistanis or pro-Khalistani so-called separatist elements in Canada that the Indian government is collecting information about. He's very specifically said that these are Canadians who are against Narendra Modi. They're collecting that information, sending it back to India, to the Indian government, who are then hiring contract killers, allegedly, to carry out these murders in Canada. Is that really making sense to people in Canada?
Again, most Canadians wouldn't have gone too deeply into this. I personally believe that those allegations are somewhat credible based off of the situation in New York. I mean, the United States also determined that there are likely agents of the Indian government attempting to conduct extrajudicial killings in the United States. I definitely have a lot more faith in their intelligence services than Canada's. Does that mean it's happening in Canada? Well, no, I wouldn't believe that unless I saw evidence, I suppose. But is it beyond the bounds of believability? No, I don't think that it is. I believe that Modi likely does have foreign intelligence agents who are conducting activities in the interests of the state of India. I mean, most countries do. That's completely within his rights to do that.
Okay. No, but I'm trying to understand why. Is it making sense when the Canadian government says that these are people who are against Narendra Modi, and then Jagmeet Singh also comes and says that you have to ban the RSS, which is a really old organization that somewhere backed the current political party which is in power in India, which is the BJP, which is Narendra Modi's party, right? So their focus being so much on the RSS, their focus being so much on Narendra Modi specifically, them saying that these are people who are against Modi. Do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
I do understand what you're saying.
And
I do understand what you're saying, and no, it does not make sense. There's obviously a lot of double standards going on here, right? Because they show a concern with regards to foreign interference when it comes to state actors from India. But as we both probably well know, the Khalistani movement is largely funded by the ISI. So why would there be concern about one type of foreign interference, but not another type of foreign interference? They very much seem to be picking sides. Could that be because of some weird thinking on Justin Trudeau's part that he needs to secure a certain vote bank? Maybe, but I don't know if he has that much smarts left in him at this point. He seems to be unraveling before our eyes.
Do you then somewhere feel that Justin Trudeau is probably making India the fall guy just to please, say, a Jagmeet Singh and his party, even if it displeases his own MPs? And I'll come to that in just a moment of what's happening politically in Canada right now and the pressure that Justin Trudeau is facing. But do you feel that he's somewhere thinking that making all of these allegations and making these moves, even if nothing comes of it, could possibly pull bring Jagmeet Singh back into the fold as far as support for his party is concerned? Because we've just seen recently how the NDP has um, pulled back, right, their support from Justin Trudeau's party. And you're looking at elections taking place next year.
Yes, I mean that the tearing up of the agreement by Jagmeet Singh was just another empty publicity stunt that meant nothing. Much like this announcement Trudeau made about India. Is India the fall guy? Yes, but so is Russia, so is Donald Trump, so is Tucker Carlson, so are the Conservative Party, so is Stephen Harper, who hasn't been prime minister for over a decade. For Justin Trudeau, anybody is the fall guy that isn't Justin Trudeau. It'll be India this week. It'll be somebody else next week, whoever is convenient for him at the time.
But Alex, how crucial is Jagmeet Singh and his support for Justin Trudeau politically?
It's becoming less important. So when he tore up the agreement, the Bloc Québécois, who is our own separatist party out of Quebec, they were able to create their own sort of supply and confidence agreement in place of Jagmeet Singh's. So yeah, I would say that his influence is large, but it's not essential to Trudeau maintaining power for another 14 months or so.
Okay, and how bad is the discontent against Justin Trudeau becoming within his own party? We've seen some members of parliament from the Liberal Party come out and speak against Justin Trudeau very recently, especially after the whole episode with India. Is there a growing discontent?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I believe that 20 MPs or more have drafted a letter seeking his resignation. 4 of his caucus members actually just resigned this week. So they're likely going to have to do a cabinet shuffle to shuffle those individuals out of caucus. It's bad, but Justin Trudeau has a really strange ability to stay in power, no matter how unpopular he is, from either the inside or the outside. So I have no confidence that this will bring down the government.
Okay. At the same time, Alex, what really is the perception amongst the people of Canada as far as his recent testimony before the foreign interference inquiry committee is concerned? Was Justin Trudeau able to give confidence to the people of Canada that they do have solid proof to back whatever claims they're making?
Most Canadians believe that the majority of the foreign interference came from China.
Right.
Those feelings, I feel, are based in a lot of logic and fact. Chinese, especially here in Vancouver, in the greater Vancouver area, Chinese money laundering has resulted in enormous increases to real estate values, and that has been a very disruptive thing to the Canadian economy and to Canadian life. The same thing happened in Sydney, Australia. This is not unique to Vancouver. So I think there is concern that China is interfering in our elections, but Justin Trudeau and Justin Trudeau style has deflected to India, Russia, Tucker Carlson, and Donald Trump, and he just looks unhinged. Canadians are interpreting that as unhinged because it's frankly absurd. I mean, Russia has an economy. I mean, they have a large military. They have an economy smaller than Texas. They were basically in total war with a direct neighbor that has the support of the West. I find it very hard to believe that Vladimir Putin is using his precious resources to affect political opinion in Ottawa. It just seems quite absurd. And Canadians are seeing it that way.
And as far as his position on China is concerned, do you think he's somewhere trying to downplay the role of China as far as this latest testimony is concerned? Because I heard it in bits and pieces. I know it was a very long testimony, and I couldn't, to be fair, I couldn't sit through all of it because
It's very
after some
difficult. He's
point,
very annoying.
that's not the reason though. But yeah, it was just because I was waiting for him to say something that would perhaps solidify what he's been trying to allege for a very long time, and I wasn't getting any of that. But as far as China is concerned, he said something very interesting that there's nothing new in what I've learned because a lot of diplomats of many countries are anyway engaged in these sort of activities where they want people who are close to them to come to power politically. So you take a very strong position against India and you make sure that you make it a little bit about Narendra Modi. But as far as China is concerned, you sort of downplay it, really saying that, listen, this is what diplomacy is anyway about. Diplomats come to a country to make sure that their favored political elite come to power.
Yeah, I mean, the entire Trudeau political dynasty has always showed a strange sort of preference for basic dictatorships, right? Even though they love to talk a lot about how much they believe in democracy and freedom of speech and all these great things. Pierre Trudeau famously, went to China. He actually tried to float his canoe to Havana to meet Fidel Castro. He later went to Cuba and, created really strong relations between Canada and Cuba at a time when the United States had one of the strictest embargoes in the world. They've long had a preference for communist regimes over democracies. It's a very creepy sort of thing that Canadians are also aware of.
Okay. Alex, you live in Surrey, where a lot of this Khalistani activity actually takes place, specifically in Gurdwara. So I want to bring your very individual perspective back to the conversation. I want to understand, are some of these posters that are left outside Gurdwaras that call for the assassination of Indian diplomats, and they literally write things like assassination wanted, do they leave some sort of a sense of discomfort amongst the people who are living there?
No, I think people understand, or if they don't, they should, that this is a tiny fraction of a
Mm-hmm.
tiny fraction of a minority. So an Indian agency report actually that I was able to obtain said that of the 250 Gurdwaras estimated in Canada, only 8 could be easily identified as pro-Khalistani. In Punjab region, in the most recent election, the Sikh Separatist Party received less than 1% of the vote. I believe it was 0.32%. So both domestically and abroad, I don't think that there is a very large group of the Sikh diaspora that believes that they want a separate Khalistani state. I think what we have is a small group of people who are well-funded and very loud. But the general sentiment on the ground is no discontent. It's just a small group of loud people, really.
Okay, but when you see a poster that's actively calling for violence, is that something that's been discussed, say, amongst friends or family, that this is absurd? Why is it that our government is
Well,
allowing this? Why are police agencies allowing it?
Canadians are kind of absurd people, right? So Canadians are very sweet, right? And I am of the belief Canada is a place for everybody, including the weirdos and the clowns. And as long as you're peaceful and you're law abiding, you can kind of say and do whatever you want. Just, don't hurt anybody. We have our own wacko separatist movement, and every 30 or 40 years, they will conduct a terrorist attack. We had the FLQ crisis in the 1960s, for instance. So there's just kind of this appetite in Canada. I wouldn't even say appetite, just a tolerance for eccentric political views to the point
Mhm.
where it hardly even goes noticed.
But is it true, Alex, that gun violence has increased in Canada, or have gang wars particularly increased in Canada?
It depends where you go. Maybe in some places more than others. I understand that they have a particularly bad problem in Brampton,
Hmm.
Ontario, and more or less the Toronto area. But Vancouver, it seems fairly par for the course. We had a very bad gang problem in the late 2000s, and I don't think it's any worse now than it was then.
And some of the areas that you've specified, has there been a demographic shift in some of these areas? Are we looking at specific demographics of people that are more, you know, or that are indulging more into these sort of activities? Because the basis of the allegations is also an increase in violence, right? That's how the Canadian government's trying to also explain it. They're literally saying that the Indian government has led, or the Indian government's interference is causing an increase in gun violence and murders and coercion and extortion.
Oh yeah,
So
no, that's just plain ridiculous. I mean, I was at the Gurdwara the day that they had their conference, and the attitudes outside, the vibe was chill. People were felt pretty safe. I mean, it was pretty much the safest place you could have been anywhere on the planet. Is the way it felt. Yeah.
but some of these Khalistani referendums in Canada, which very openly and actively demand the breakup of India, have they ever been taken up seriously by the Canadian political class?
No, it would probably very
So
much disappoint the World Sikh Organization, Sikhs for Justice, to hear that. No, I know that it's been very upsetting for the government in India, and I think
yes.
that's the purpose of the protest. But in Canada, it's made no impression at all. It's considered maybe even like a little bit of a amusing sideshow for Canadians. But maybe they also don't understand the gravity of the problem fully.
Yeah, right. So, Alex, why do you think that a year later the Canadian government hasn't been able to provide any concrete proof against some of the very serious allegations that it's leveled against India? They've had 1 year to really collect that evidence and put something out there for the world. Now, what they've done is last year they made the same allegations, and now they've come out and the RCMP has said that there are 8 cases of murders, 22 cases of extortions, but they're all before the court of law. So that's it. That's all that we can tell you. But uh, we have evidence that Indian officials are involved. And that's literally the same thing you said last year. And the Indian government had said, please give us this evidence that you have.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all. So I do a little bit of court reporting, and there was a case out of Alberta. This was during our anti-Trudeau protest, more broadly colloquially called the Freedom Convoy protest. There were 4
Yes.
gentlemen who were arrested in Alberta. They were denied bail for the better part of 2 years while the government accumulated its evidence. When I attended the trial, there was no evidence. The evidence amounted to them saying that the 2 men were speaking in code. So when they would say things like, "Oh, bring hockey sticks down to the protest," what they really meant was AK-47s. That carrots and peas meant bombs and all kinds of crazy stuff. So to answer your question, the reason they haven't provided any evidence is because they're not competent enough to provide evidence. Even if there was evidence, which I don't necessarily believe that there is, they wouldn't be competent enough to collect it. And yeah,
But
this government
okay.
has had 9 years to do anything competently. They haven't done anything competently, and 9 years is why the country is such a mess.
But Alex, you earlier spoke about Jagmeet Singh's influence sort of pulling away from the political atmosphere in Canada right now, that it's lessening in a way, and that as per you, he's not as important to Justin Trudeau as he was. If that's the case, who do you think is advising Justin Trudeau to take this sort of a line against India at this point in time? Like, why is he going on to take on a very public diplomatic standoff with India? Is that simply an election strategy, and they're just taking that? Uh, they're just going with the flow right now, thinking that okay, once uh, if this does make an impact amongst the public, and we do come back to power, then we'll try to iron out some of this mess that we're creating. Who do you think is advising him, perhaps, to take this position?
I think he very much dances to the sound or the beat of his own drum. I don't think that anyone advises him at all. We've learned that in the interference inquiry. I mean, he says that he simply doesn't read the memos that come across his desk. So I think that we are kind of dealing with a bit of a maniac type situation where he's not taking the advice of absolutely anyone, and he surrounded himself with yes men and women, right? So Melanie Joly, Chrystia Freeland, these characters, they will pretty much just go with whatever he says. He was in Laos when all of this before all of this started. He was in Laos on the weekend. And it was Canadian Thanksgiving on Monday. It was a most unusual time for him to make that press conference, where he made the allegations about India, because he had already made those allegations last September in the House of Commons. It's unusual to make any kind of press conference. The timing was between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. Canadian time, depending on which time zone you are. Like India, Canada's huge, of course. It's 4 hours. So right before Thanksgiving dinner, this is usually a time when families are together, he made this announcement, but with no extra evidence. There was no real purpose for it. And so it is widely speculated there was a caucus revolt while he was in his plane from Laos back to Canada. It is widely speculated that he had a day to think about this caucus revolt and decided to make this announcement purely selfishly on the advice of absolutely no one. He may have roped in the RCMP. I have my doubts about the independence between the RCMP, that's our federal policing force, and Justin Trudeau, because he said that the reason they made the announcement was because the RCMP had a duty of care. But we know from the CBC documentary we were speaking about earlier that the RCMP has been delivering these duties of care reports to Khalistani separatists and other people they believe are targeted by the Indian government for well over a year. So there was no purpose logistically for this press conference other than perhaps an exercise in distraction and deflection from how unpopular he is within his own party. That's my take on it.
Okay, so you do believe, and are there others or within the political analysts in Canada, how are they reading this entire situation? Do they feel that this is just now reduced to a political strategy for Justin Trudeau and he's ready to, and I'm not boasting here at all, this is just fact, right? India being the fifth largest economy and on its way, it's just exceeding and it's moving ahead with time. So he's okay really souring relations with India at this point in time, simply for a political strategy for the elections next year? How are the political analysts or economists in Canada reading the situation?
It depends. So there are two types of political analysts in Canada right now. There are the Pravda style analysts, and then there are the independent analysts. So we very much have a state-run media elite in Canada. Those are your CBCs, CTVs, Global News. They're all completely reliant on taxpayer subsidies to remain relevant, and so they will just say anything that Trudeau wants them to. This group has unflinchingly accepted the Trudeau narrative without evidence that Indian agents conducted this killing. They haven't even brought up the question of, well, if that's the case, do foreign leaders have a right to extrajudicial killings if they have a suspected terrorist living abroad who the government abroad is refusing to extradite on account of crimes? They're not even asking these questions right now. It's just purely a narrative of Trudeau is correct.
So they're not asking why the Indian government has been supplying lists of possible troublemakers who are currently residing in Canada, being in a way given asylum by Canada, shielded by Canada. So nobody's asking Trudeau the tough questions that why aren't you then cooperating with the Indian government and then sending these people back? What are you getting keeping them in your country?
They're not even asking why they weren't properly vetted on arrival. Through immigration. These questions are not even being asked.
Which is the same for Hardeep Singh Nijjar, right? That it was a fake.
Yeah, I mean,
it was fake.
He tried to fake coming in 1997. That's right.
Yes.
Under a completely fake name. Then came, married a woman very conveniently. Yada yada yada. Yeah, but this is they don't question anything that Trudeau does. It's very, very Pravda-like. It's completely surreal because Canadian media didn't used to be this way. Independence, maybe it's just by the ecosystem of this very strange media landscape that we find ourselves in, have taken the opposite approach, where they've taken a completely skeptical, somewhat promotive approach. I personally, from my own perspective, I'm just one person, from my own humble little perspective, believe that that is also naive. I tend to take the belief that Trudeau is probably right, but I just don't believe him because it's Trudeau.
Okay.
Wrap your head around that.
Alex, before we wrap up, I just want to understand one last aspect from you as well. How is the larger Sikh community of Canada viewing all of these developments and the fact that um, the Khalistani activities on Canadian soil have really become a major reason as to why Canada is being painted as this new Pakistan, especially in India, where a lot of the analysts and voices in India feel that Canada somewhere has become the new Pakistan, where they want to continue fielding and supporting these people who are leading separatist movements or who are really calling for very violent acts against the current Indian government and its officials. How is the larger Sikh community viewing all of this?
Well, the larger Sikh community goes back many, many, many decades. So it's a very deeply rooted, deeply assimilated group of people. And I would say that they're so enmeshed in Canadian culture at this point that the vast majority of Sikhs, like most Canadians, don't care at all. They don't even know that this is happening. Um, it's really that simple. I mean, those who do care think that it's sort of an amusing sideshow. This is a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction of people. They're very well funded, and the threat to India is very real, and the threat to Canadians is real as well, I suppose. But Canadians have also, they don't have a very good knowledge of the Air India bombings. They don't have much experience at all being victims of terrorism, so they're quite naive and quite oblivious. And that includes those in the Sikh diaspora largely.
And you just mentioned the Air India bombing. There's never really been an attempt to educate the Canadian population that was literally before 9/11 the worst terror attack that the world had
Correct.
seen.
Yeah, so I believe they did a poll, and it was something along the lines of it was less than 1 out of every 20 Canadians even knew that the event occurred. So interestingly, you may find this curious if you're interested in kind of Canadian Indo relations and history. There was a ship of Sikhs. They were seeking refuge in Canada in the early 20th century. The Catamaru Maganda, I believe it is. So that's required learning in Canada. You have to know that in order to pass through History 10 or History 11. So, it's singed into all of our brains. That happened well over 100 years ago. We never learned about the Air India bombing at all in school. Not once.
Interesting. And why do you think that there's been an attempt to really just completely erase it out of everybody's memories? And the reason why I ask that is because as far as 9/11 is concerned, Alex, no matter what part of the world you're in, you do know about it because
Of course, yeah.
Americans, and rightly so, right? They've made sure that the world remembers what happened, how awful it was, and that they are completely against terrorism, specifically on their own soil. But the fact that um, it's really bizarre to me that something so big happened in Canada. Hundreds of Canadian lives were also lost in that terrorist attack, and yet today it seems as though there's been a complete uh, just a complete washout of the entire memory. And it seems that it comes somewhere from the Canadian government and the Canadian system itself, which is just trying to make sure that that portion of Canadian history is completely erased. And nobody talks about the fact that the man that you see on the posters outside some of those gurdwaras in places like Surrey, where you live, right, is Talvinder Singh Parman, who was the mastermind of the Air India bombing, and he's today remembered as a martyr on Canadian soil by, like you said, rightly pointed out, that it's a minuscule part of an already minority part of the Canadian population, but still, for that to be allowed on Canadian soil, and yet nobody really knows about it.
Yeah, I think there's two explanations. One is an obsession with multiculturalism. So I think that Canada is always seeking to, well, since Pierre Trudeau enacted or codified multiculturalism into Canadian law, there has been a concerted efforts and millions of dollars spent by the Canadian government to alleviate its population of racism. And so I think this is like kind of part of that design, right? Is that they don't want Canadians to know about this part of their history because they may fear that it would stoke anti-Indian racism or anti-Sikhism or Indophobia or whatever else it might be. And then also there's a second prong to this, which is very real racism. The Sikh diaspora was not as well enmeshed into Canadian culture in the mid 1980s. And so most of the Canadian citizens on board the flight were of Indian origin. And so I think a lot of Canadians just didn't care that much because they didn't have a lot of connections to that part of the world at that
Right.
time. So that's very understandable in some ways. It's not necessarily racist. It's just you can't mourn what you don't know, right?
Right.
So I think that's probably the two reasons that Canadians just don't know about it.
Don't know about it, and also just to understand that was probably where the seeds of Khalistanis entering Canada also began. And it was Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau. Our Prime Minister back then, Indira Gandhi, had made a request to extradite this man, Talvinder Singh Parmar, to India. He was caught in Germany, but then he was sent back to Canada because Canada felt that he's not going to get a free and fair trial, or he's not going to be treated fairly in India. So there's so much of that history, and like you've given a pretty decent explanation for it, but still, it's important for the people of Canada to perhaps wake up and understand that this is not something that started last year.
Right.
After this killing of this man, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, this goes back decades, where India's been struggling to really make Canada understand that you're just allowing Khalistani separatists to get asylum in your country, and you don't know the day they're going to turn, and there's going to be violence, which is what Canada is now coming out and saying, that there's increased gang violence, or there's increased gun violence, and there are murders and extortions, and so many times Canadian media has also found out, Alex, that these are simply killings that are due to gang wars. This really doesn't have to do a lot with foreign interference per se, but it's simply one gang against the other.
Potentially, but we do know from the recent indictment in the United States, based off of their allegations, again, nothing has been proven in court necessarily, but the CIA has, in their reports, which they made public, and there were, of course, the unredacted documents out of New York last year that showed they have fairly credible intelligence showing that the Indian government may in fact enlist people in gangs to carry out some of these extrajudicial killings. So I don't think it's completely beyond the bounds of believability. I mean, I think it would be unlikely, it would be almost statistically impossible if it was just gang warfare that all of the most prominent pro-Sikh separatist activists are the ones being targeted by these random gangsters. I mean, that just seems very unlikely to me. So I do believe there is some credibility to Trudeau's claims, but I don't necessarily believe it entirely, simply on account of it coming from Trudeau. But I think it would be naive to think that there's not some truth to it.
Okay. Alex, I just concluding the conversation, I just want to understand from you. You said that whatever Trudeau is saying we're doing right now is perhaps not reaching most Canadians, because you said that most Canadians don't really care. So, just as a concluding thought, why do you think this is the issue that Justin Trudeau wants to raise right now, instead of genuine domestic problems within Canada that he could possibly raise, because it is an election year?
Because he's losing on every domestic issue, whether it be housing, healthcare, education, foreign affairs. He's losing on absolutely everything. And so he has to pick a fight with India, of all people. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd hate to have to be the person who explains the logic of Justin Trudeau, because I think it's a bit of a fool's errand, because I don't think there is a lot of logic. I think we're dealing with a very unhinged person.
Okay. All right, Alex, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so
Thanks.
much for joining us on NewsX.
Thank you.